The Legacy of Jim. Chapter 1, The Bait. The sun had just begun to rise over the tranquil lake as Jim set out in his boat, ready for another day of fishing. The water was still and calm, with a thin layer of mist hovering just above the surface. Jim took a deep breath of the crisp morning air, feeling a sense of peace and contentment wash over him. He had been coming to this lake for years, ever since he was a young boy. His father had taught him how to fish, and they had spent countless weekends here, casting their lines and enjoying each other's company. Now, Jim came here alone, but the memories of those days with his father still lingered. As he rode out into the middle of the lake, Jim carefully selected his bait. He had a variety of lures and worms, but he decided to go with a shiny silver spoon that had always seemed to attract the biggest fish. He carefully tied it onto his line, making sure it was secure. As he cast his line out into the water, Jim felt a rush of excitement. He knew that there were some truly impressive fish lurking beneath the surface of this lake, and he was determined to catch one. He settled back into his boat, waiting patiently for the first bite. It didn't take long. Within minutes, he felt a tug on his line, and he quickly reeled it in. To his disappointment, he saw that it was just a small perch, hardly worth keeping. He tossed it back into the water and cast his line out again. This time, he waited a bit longer before he felt another tug. This one was stronger, and he could tell that it was a bigger fish. He started to reel it in, feeling the weight of the fish tugging against his line. It was a struggle, but he was determined to catch this one. Finally, he saw the fish break the surface of the water. It was a largemouth bass, easily the biggest one he had ever seen. Jim's heart raced as he worked to reel it in, feeling a sense of triumph as he finally pulled it into his boat. He held the fish up, admiring its size and beauty. It was a magnificent creature, with a glossy green back and sharp teeth. Jim smiled, feeling a sense of satisfaction and pride. He had caught the biggest fish of his life. As he packed up his gear and headed back to shore, Jim couldn't help but feel grateful for this lake and the peace and solitude it provided him. Fishing had always been more than just a hobby to him, it was a way of connecting with his father and with nature itself. And today, he had caught the fish of a lifetime, a memory that would stay with him forever. Chapter 2, The Catch. The sun was high in the sky as Jim pulled his boat up onto the shore. He had caught a few more fish since the largemouth bass, but nothing could compare to the thrill of reeling in such a monster. He cleaned the fish he had caught and packed them into his cooler, ready to take them home for dinner. As he was loading his gear into his truck, he heard a familiar voice call out to him. "Jim. Is that you?" He turned to see his old friend Dave walking towards him. Dave was a fellow fisherman who Jim had met on the lake years ago. They had become fast friends, bonding over their love of fishing. "Dave, good to see you," Jim said, walking over to greet him. They shook hands and chatted for a bit, catching up on each other's lives. Dave asked Jim how the fishing had been, and Jim couldn't help but smile as he told him about the huge bass he had caught earlier that day. "Damn, Jim, that's impressive," Dave said, patting him on the back. "I've been coming to this lake for years, and I've never seen a bass that big." Jim felt a sense of pride and satisfaction at Dave's words. He had always been competitive when it came to fishing, and he loved to outdo his fellow fishermen. "Yeah, it was a real catch," Jim said, grinning. "I feel like I could go home now and be satisfied for the rest of the season." Dave laughed. "Well, don't get too cocky. You know there's always a bigger fish out there." Jim nodded, knowing that Dave was right. He never liked to rest on his laurels when it came to fishing. There was always a bigger challenge to conquer, a bigger catch to make. As they said their goodbyes and headed off in their separate directions, Jim couldn't help but feel a sense of anticipation. He knew that he had caught something special today, but he also knew that there was always another challenge waiting for him on the water. That night, as he cooked the fish he had caught, Jim couldn't help but feel a sense of pride. He had always loved the taste of fresh-caught fish, and this one tasted especially sweet. He savored each bite, feeling a sense of gratitude for the lake and for the sport of fishing that had given him so much joy over the years. But even as he enjoyed his dinner, Jim couldn't shake the feeling that there was still more out there for him to catch. He knew that he would be back on the water soon, ready to face whatever challenge lay ahead. For him, the thrill of the catch was an addiction, and one that he never wanted to give up. Chapter 3: The Competition. Jim woke up early the next morning, eager to get back on the water. He loaded up his truck with his gear and set out for the lake, feeling a sense of excitement as he thought about the possibility of catching another big fish. As he arrived at the lake, he noticed that there were more fishermen out than usual. It was a beautiful day, with clear skies and warm temperatures, and it seemed like everyone had decided to take advantage of the perfect conditions. Jim didn't mind the competition. In fact, he relished it. He loved the challenge of trying to outfish the other anglers, and he was confident that his skills would give him an edge. He launched his boat and set out into the water, casting his line out and scanning the surface for any sign of movement. As he fished, he couldn't help but notice that there was one angler in particular who seemed to be doing well. He was a young man, probably in his early 20s, with a serious look on his face and a boat full of gear. Jim didn't know him, but he couldn't help but feel a sense of competition with him. He watched as the young man reeled in fish after fish, his technique smooth and efficient. Jim knew that he would have to step up his game if he wanted to beat him. For hours, Jim fished, his determination growing with each passing minute. He caught a few small fish, but nothing that could compare to the largemouth bass he had caught the day before. He glanced over at the young man's boat and saw that he had caught another big fish, a trophy-sized walleye. Jim felt a pang of envy as he watched the young man hold up his catch, feeling a sense of frustration that he hadn't been able to catch anything of that size. He knew that he was a skilled angler, but it seemed like luck was not on his side today. As the day wore on, Jim grew tired and a little discouraged. He packed up his gear and started to row back to shore, feeling a sense of disappointment that he hadn't been able to catch anything more impressive. But as he neared the shore, something caught his eye. It was a flash of silver in the water, and he knew immediately what it was. He pulled out his line and cast it towards the spot where he had seen the flash, feeling a sense of anticipation building inside of him. For a few minutes, he waited, feeling the weight of his line against the water. And then, suddenly, he felt a tug. It was a strong one, and he knew immediately that he had caught something big. He worked to reel it in, his muscles straining with effort. As he pulled it closer to his boat, he could see that it was a massive fish, easily the biggest one he had ever caught. He felt a surge of triumph as he pulled it into his boat, feeling a sense of satisfaction that he had beaten the young man's catch. As he drove home that evening with the massive fish in his cooler, Jim couldn't help but feel a sense of pride. He had proven to himself that he was still one of the best anglers on the lake, and he knew that there would always be another challenge waiting for him out on the water. Chapter 4: A New Friend. The next day, Jim woke up feeling a sense of excitement. He had caught the biggest fish of his life the day before, and he was eager to get back on the water to see if he could repeat his success. As he launched his boat and set out into the lake, he noticed a man standing on the shore, watching him intently. The man was middle-aged, with a friendly smile and a twinkle in his eye. Jim waved at him, and the man waved back. For hours, Jim fished, casting his line out and scanning the surface of the water for any sign of movement. He caught a few small fish, but nothing of note. As he rowed back towards the shore, he noticed that the man was still there, watching him. Jim pulled up to the shore, and the man approached him. "Hey there," he said, extending his hand. "I saw you out there fishing all day. You must be pretty good to spend that long out there without catching anything big." Jim laughed. "I had a big catch yesterday, but today's been slow." "I'm Jim, by the way." "I'm Tom," the man said. "Mind if I ask you a few questions about fishing?" Jim shrugged. "Sure, why not?" And so, Jim and Tom spent the next half hour talking about fishing techniques, lures, and the best places to catch different types of fish. Jim was impressed by Tom's knowledge and enthusiasm, and he found himself enjoying the conversation. As they talked, Jim learned that Tom was a retired carpenter who had recently moved to the area. He was a passionate fisherman who spent most of his free time out on the lake, and he was always looking for new tips and tricks to improve his skills. Jim found himself warming up to Tom, enjoying the easy camaraderie that had developed between them. He invited Tom to come out on his boat the next day, and Tom eagerly accepted. The next morning, Jim and Tom set out into the lake together, their boats side by side. They fished together, sharing tips and techniques as they cast their lines out into the water. As the day wore on, Jim found himself enjoying Tom's company more and more. He appreciated Tom's enthusiasm and his willingness to learn, and he found himself opening up to him in a way that he hadn't with many other people. As the sun started to set, Jim and Tom reeled in their lines and packed up their gear. Jim felt a sense of gratitude towards Tom, feeling like he had made a new friend out on the water. As they parted ways, Jim promised to take Tom out on his boat again soon. He felt a sense of contentment as he drove home, feeling like he had found a new connection that was deeper than just a shared love of fishing. Chapter 5: A Lesson Learned. The next few weeks passed quickly for Jim. He spent most of his free time out on the lake with Tom, enjoying the peacefulness and the thrill of the catch. He found himself looking forward to their fishing trips more and more each week, relishing the chance to spend time with his new friend. One afternoon, Jim and Tom were out on the water, fishing for bass. Jim was trying out a new lure that he had recently bought, hoping to land a big one. Tom was casting a spinner bait, his favorite lure for bass fishing. As they fished, they talked about everything from their families to their favorite fishing spots. Jim was relaxed and happy, enjoying the conversation and the companionship. Suddenly, Jim felt a tug on his line. He reeled it in, feeling a thrill of excitement as he saw a large bass flapping on the end of his hook. He called out to Tom, who quickly paddled over to help him bring the fish aboard. But as they worked together to bring the fish in, disaster struck. Tom's line got tangled in the motor of Jim's boat, and the tension of the fish caused the line to snap. Jim watched in horror as the bass, still hooked, jumped back into the water and swam away. He felt a sense of disappointment and frustration, knowing that he had lost a potential trophy catch. Tom looked up at him, his face filled with regret. "I'm sorry, Jim," he said. "I didn't mean for that to happen." Jim took a deep breath, trying to push down his anger. He knew that it was just a fishing trip, but he couldn't help feeling upset. "It's okay," he said finally. "Just be more careful next time." The rest of the fishing trip was quiet and subdued. Jim found himself struggling to shake off his disappointment, feeling like the day had been ruined by the lost fish. As they pulled their boats back onto the shore, Jim found himself feeling distant from Tom. He knew that it wasn't Tom's fault, but he couldn't help feeling like the incident had put a damper on their friendship. Over the next few days, Jim found himself avoiding Tom. He made excuses to avoid their fishing trips, feeling like he needed some time to cool off. But as the days passed, Jim realized that he was being unfair to Tom. He knew that accidents happened, and that holding on to his anger wasn't helping anyone. One afternoon, Jim called up Tom and invited him to go fishing again. Tom accepted, and they set out onto the water once more. As they fished, Jim found himself apologizing to Tom for his behavior. He told him that he knew that accidents happened, and that he was sorry for letting his frustration get the better of him. Tom nodded, accepting Jim's apology. "It's all good," he said. "We all make mistakes sometimes." And with that, Jim felt a sense of relief. He realized that true friendship was about more than just catching fish. It was about forgiveness, understanding, and a willingness to move past mistakes. As they fished together, Jim felt a sense of contentment, knowing that he had learned an important lesson about friendship and the value of forgiveness. Chapter 6: A Perfect Day on the Water. The sun was just starting to rise as Jim and Tom loaded up their fishing gear into the back of Tom's pickup truck. They were headed out to a lake that Tom had been telling Jim about for weeks, a secret fishing spot that he promised was full of big bass. Jim was excited to see this new spot, and he had a feeling that it was going to be a great day of fishing. They arrived at the lake just as the sun was peeking over the horizon. Jim couldn't help but marvel at the beauty of the scenery around them. The lake was surrounded by tall trees and rolling hills, and the water was so clear that Jim could see all the way to the bottom. As they launched their boats, Jim felt a sense of anticipation building inside of him. He had a good feeling about this lake, and he knew that they were going to have a great day on the water. They paddled out to a spot near the center of the lake, and Tom quickly got to work setting up his fishing gear. Jim followed suit, rigging up a new lure that he had been itching to try out. As they began to cast their lines, Jim felt a sense of peace wash over him. The sound of the water lapping against the side of the boat was soothing, and the fresh air was invigorating. They fished in silence for a while, each lost in his own thoughts. But soon enough, Jim felt a tug on his line. He reeled it in quickly, feeling a rush of excitement as he saw a large bass wriggling on the end of his hook. Tom looked over at him, a grin spreading across his face. "Looks like you've got a big one there, Jim," he said. They worked together to bring the fish onto the boat, and Jim couldn't help but feel a sense of triumph as he held up the prize catch. But the day was just getting started. Over the next few hours, they caught more bass than they could count, each one bigger than the last. They laughed and joked as they reeled in their catches, enjoying the thrill of the catch and the camaraderie of the moment. As the sun began to set, Jim realized that they had been out on the water for hours. He felt tired, but also exhilarated. It had been a perfect day on the water, and he knew that he would remember it for years to come. As they packed up their gear and headed back to shore, Jim turned to Tom and smiled. "Thanks for taking me out here, Tom," he said. "This has been an amazing day." Tom nodded, a look of contentment on his face. "Anytime, my friend," he replied. "I'm glad we could share this experience together." And with that, they loaded up their gear and headed back to town, both feeling a sense of satisfaction and joy that comes from a day spent doing what you love with someone you care about. Chapter 7: The One That Got Away. Jim and Tom had been planning their next fishing trip for weeks. They had heard about a lake a few hours away that was known for its huge muskies, and they were both eager to test their skills against these elusive fish. They arrived at the lake just as the sun was starting to rise, and they quickly launched their boats and set out onto the water. The lake was beautiful, with clear blue water and towering cliffs rising up on either side. They fished for several hours, casting their lines out and patiently waiting for a bite. They had caught a few smaller fish, but neither of them had hooked a muskie yet. As the day wore on, Jim's patience began to wear thin. He had come all this way to catch a muskie, and he was starting to wonder if it was even worth the effort. But just as he was about to give up hope, he felt a tug on his line. He reeled in quickly, feeling a surge of excitement as he realized that he had finally hooked a muskie. The fish was huge, easily the biggest one he had ever caught. It fought hard, pulling him back and forth across the lake as he struggled to bring it in. Tom paddled over to help him, and together they worked to get the fish onto the boat. But just as they were about to land it, the muskie made one last desperate leap out of the water, shaking its head wildly and snapping the line in two. Jim was devastated. He had come so close to catching the fish of his dreams, only to have it slip away at the last moment. Tom put a hand on his shoulder, a sympathetic look on his face. "Don't worry, Jim," he said. "That's just part of fishing. Sometimes you catch the fish, and sometimes the fish catches you." Jim nodded, but he couldn't shake the feeling of disappointment. He had been so close to catching that muskie, and now it was gone forever. They fished for a while longer, but the excitement of the day had faded. Jim couldn't help but think about the one that got away, and he found it hard to focus on anything else. As they headed back to shore, Jim couldn't help but feel a sense of regret. He had come all this way to catch a muskie, and now he had failed. But as they loaded up their gear and headed back home, Jim realized that he had learned an important lesson. Fishing wasn't just about catching fish. It was about the experience, the thrill of the chase, and the joy of spending time on the water with good friends. And even though he hadn't caught the muskie, he knew that he had still had a great day on the water. After all, sometimes the most important thing isn't the fish that you catch, but the memories that you make along the way. Chapter 8, Reflections. The next day, Jim sat on the dock, gazing out at the water. He had been thinking a lot about his recent fishing trip, and he couldn't help but feel a sense of nostalgia for the days when he had first started fishing. Back then, he had fished for the pure joy of it. He had spent long hours on the water, not caring if he caught anything or not. It was the experience that he had loved, the feeling of being out in nature and away from the hustle and bustle of daily life. But as he had grown older, he had become more focused on the catch. He had started to measure his success in terms of how many fish he had caught, or how big they were. The joy of fishing had become secondary to the pursuit of the fish. Now, after his recent trip, he realized that he had lost sight of what was truly important. The muskie that he had failed to catch had taught him a valuable lesson, that fishing wasn't just about catching fish, but about the experience itself. He resolved to change his approach to fishing. He would no longer measure his success in terms of the catch, but in terms of the memories that he made on the water. He would fish for the joy of it, not for the fish themselves. As he sat there on the dock, he felt a sense of peace wash over him. He knew that there would be many more fishing trips in his future, and he was excited to approach them with a renewed sense of purpose. He looked out at the water once more, and felt a sense of gratitude for the beauty of the world around him. Fishing was just one way to connect with nature, and he was grateful for the opportunity to do so. As the sun began to set over the lake, he picked up his fishing rod and cast his line out into the water. He didn't care if he caught anything that day. All that mattered was the feeling of the sun on his face, the sound of the water lapping against the dock, and the joy of being alive in that moment. Chapter 9, A New Perspective. Over the next few months, Jim's renewed love for fishing took him on some of the best trips of his life. He no longer cared about catching the biggest fish or the most fish. Instead, he focused on the experience of being out on the water and the joy of spending time with his friends. On one trip, he and Tom camped out on the shore of a small lake, cooking their meals over a campfire and telling stories long into the night. They fished during the day, but even when they didn't catch anything, they still felt fulfilled and content. On another trip, he took his young daughter out on the water for the first time. She was fascinated by the fish and the lures, and Jim was thrilled to be able to share his love of fishing with her. As he spent more time on the water, Jim began to notice the beauty of the natural world around him. He saw the way that the sun reflected off the water, creating a glittering path across the lake. He heard the sound of the loons calling to one another in the distance. He felt the cool breeze on his face, and the warmth of the sun on his skin. He also began to notice the impact that humans were having on the environment. He saw trash left behind on the shorelines, and he noticed the way that some fishermen would take more fish than they needed. He realized that he had a responsibility to care for the natural world, to leave it as beautiful and vibrant for future generations as it had been for him. He started to make changes in his own fishing practices. He only took what he needed, and he made sure to properly dispose of any trash. He also began to educate others about the importance of conservation and sustainability. As he fished, he felt a sense of purpose and fulfillment that he had never experienced before. Fishing had become more than just a hobby. It was a way for him to connect with nature, to find peace and solace in a chaotic world, and to make a positive impact on the world around him. And as he looked out at the water, he knew that he would always love fishing, not just for the thrill of the catch, but for the joy of the journey. Chapter 10, The Legacy of Fishing. Years passed, and Jim continued to fish with a renewed sense of purpose and appreciation. He took his daughter out on the water regularly, and they shared many happy memories together. He also continued to educate others about the importance of conservation and sustainability, becoming a leader in his local fishing community. As he grew older, Jim began to think more about his legacy. He wanted to leave behind something that would make a positive impact on the world, something that would last long after he was gone. He decided to use his love of fishing to create a program that would introduce children to the joys of fishing and teach them about conservation and sustainability. He partnered with local schools and community organizations to create a curriculum that included fishing trips, lessons on the importance of conservation, and activities designed to teach children about the natural world. The program was a success, and Jim was thrilled to see the joy and wonder on the children's faces as they caught their first fish. He knew that he was making a difference, not just in the lives of the children, but in the world around him. As he looked back on his life, he realized that fishing had taught him some of the most important lessons he had ever learned. It had taught him about patience, perseverance, and respect for the natural world. It had taught him about the importance of living in the moment and appreciating the beauty of the world around him. And as he looked out at the water one last time, he felt a sense of peace and contentment. He knew that his love of fishing would live on, not just in the memories of his friends and family, but in the lives of the children he had touched through his program. He smiled, knowing that he had lived a full and meaningful life, one that had been enriched by the simple joy of fishing. And as he closed his eyes, he felt a sense of gratitude for the gift of life and the beauty of the natural world. Chapter 11: The Circle of Life. As Jim's life drew to a close, his friends and family gathered around him to say their final goodbyes. They shared stories and memories of their time together, and they all agreed that Jim had lived a full and meaningful life. As they sat together, watching the sunset over the water, a fish jumped out of the water and splashed back down. Jim's daughter smiled and said, "Look, Dad, the fish are saying goodbye." Jim smiled, knowing that even in death, he would always be connected to the natural world he had loved so much. As the days passed, Jim's friends and family returned to their normal lives, but they never forgot the lessons he had taught them. They continued to fish, not just for the thrill of the catch, but for the joy of the journey. They took care to preserve the natural world, and they shared their love of fishing with others, just as Jim had done. And as they fished, they felt Jim's presence with them, guiding them and reminding them of the beauty and fragility of the natural world. Years later, Jim's daughter took her own children out on the water for the first time. As they fished, she told them stories about her father and the lessons he had taught her. And as they caught their first fish, she knew that her father's legacy would live on, not just in her memories, but in the lives of her children and their children's children. And as she watched the fish swim back into the water, she knew that life was a circle, and that everything was connected. The fish they caught today would feed the birds and other creatures of the natural world, continuing the circle of life that her father had taught her to appreciate and respect. And as she looked out at the water, she felt a sense of gratitude for the gift of life and the beauty of the natural world, just as her father had before her. Chapter 12: The Endless Journey. Years had passed since Jim had passed away, and the world had changed in many ways. Technology had advanced, and the pace of life had quickened. But out on the water, the rhythm of life remained the same. The fish still swam in the deep, and the birds still circled overhead. Jim's daughter had grown up, and she now had children of her own. They fished together often, and she shared with them the stories of her father and the lessons he had taught her. One day, as they fished together, her son asked, "Mom, do you ever think about where the fish go after we catch them?" She smiled and said, "Well, some of them go back into the water, and others become food for other creatures. But I like to think that some of them go on an endless journey." "An endless journey?" her son asked. "Yes," she said. "I like to imagine that the fish we catch are just a small part of a much larger journey. They travel through the rivers and oceans, up and down the coasts, and maybe even across the world. And even after we catch them, their journey continues." Her son thought about this for a moment and then said, "That's kind of like life, isn't it? We're all on a journey, and even when we're gone, the journey continues." His mother smiled, proud of her son's insight. "Yes, it is. And just like the fish, we're all connected. Our journey is intertwined with the journeys of those around us, and we all have an impact on the world around us. As they continued to fish, they talked about the journey of life and the importance of appreciating the beauty of the natural world. And as they caught their first fish of the day, they felt a sense of wonder and gratitude for the endless journey of life, and the simple joy of fishing. Chapter 13, The Legacy of Jim. Years turned into decades, and Jim's legacy continued to live on. His daughter had grown old, and she now had grandchildren who loved to fish with her. She continued to share her father's stories and lessons with them, passing on the gift of fishing and the love of the natural world to a new generation. The world had changed in many ways, but the rhythm of life out on the water remained the same. The fish still swam in the deep, and the birds still circled overhead. And even as new generations came and went, the lessons that Jim had taught so many years ago remained just as relevant. One day, as Jim's granddaughter fished alone, she felt a sense of sadness. She knew that one day, she would have to say goodbye to the natural world that had brought her so much joy and wonder. She thought about her grandfather and the lessons he had taught her, and she knew that he would want her to keep fishing, to keep exploring, and to keep appreciating the beauty of the world around her. As she cast her line, she felt a tug on the other end. She reeled it in, and as she pulled the fish out of the water, she felt a surge of gratitude. She knew that she was a part of something much larger than herself, and that the natural world would continue long after she was gone. And as she released the fish back into the water, she felt a sense of hope. She knew that, just like her grandfather, she was a small part of a much larger journey. And even after she was gone, the legacy of Jim would continue, inspiring new generations to appreciate the beauty and wonder of the natural world, and to keep fishing, no matter what challenges the world may face. As she watched the fish swim away, she smiled, knowing that her grandfather's legacy would live on, just like the fish that continued to journey through the rivers and oceans, reminding us all of the endless wonder and beauty of the natural world. Chapter 14, A New Beginning. The world had changed once again, and the natural world was facing new challenges. Climate change had brought about unpredictable weather patterns, and pollution had taken its toll on the rivers and oceans. The future of fishing was uncertain, and many feared that the simple joy of being out on the water would be lost forever. But there were those who refused to give up. They knew that the legacy of Jim and the love of fishing were too important to let go of. They came together from all corners of the world, united by their passion for fishing and their love of the natural world. They worked tirelessly to restore the rivers and oceans, to clean up the pollution, and to protect the fragile ecosystems that were so crucial to the survival of the fish and other creatures that called them home. And slowly but surely, they began to see the results of their hard work. The fish returned in greater numbers, and the rivers and oceans began to thrive once again. People began to rediscover the simple joy of fishing, and the natural world once again became a source of wonder and awe. And as the sun rose over the water, casting a warm glow over the faces of those who had gathered to fish, they knew that this was just the beginning. The journey would continue, and there would always be new challenges to face. But with the legacy of Jim and the passion of those who refused to give up, they knew that the future was bright. As they cast their lines into the water, they felt a sense of gratitude and wonder. They knew that they were a part of something much larger than themselves, and that the journey of life was truly endless. And as they caught their first fish of the day, they smiled, knowing that the legacy of Jim would live on, inspiring new generations to appreciate the beauty and wonder of the natural world, and to keep fishing, no matter what challenges the world may face. The end.